The archive door was bleeding, not metaphorically, not symbolically. Actual dark crimsons seeped from the ancient iron seams of the vault door buried beneath Oberon Corvinus's estate, pooling against the stone floor in slow, deliberate rivulets, as though the door itself had veins, and something had punctured them. Beatrice Sable pressed her back against the cold corridor wall and told herself she was not afraid. She had survived worse. She had survived her own mother, selling her location to the Crimson Court for a fistful of gold and a whispered promise of protection. She had survived 3 months running across 4 countries with nothing but a stolen coat and her own ferocious intelligence. She had survived walking through the front gates of the most powerful vampire king on the continent and demanding sanctuary with the kind of controlled, shameless audacity that had made his entire court go silent. She not, however, survived the archive door choosing her. The moment her fingertips had brushed the iron surface, curious, reckless, just wanting to understand what was behind it. Every lock, every seal, every blood ward etched into the metal over what she could only assume were centuries had dissolved. Not broken, dissolved, as though they had simply been waiting for permission to step aside. The corridor behind her erupted with sound, boots on stone, voices carrying the cold, clipped authority of vampire guards, and then the voice that cut through all of it like a blade finding its mark. Stand away from her. Oberon Corvinus moved through his own guards the way a storm moved through trees, not violently, not with visible effort, but with the absolute certainty that everything in his path would yield. He was tall and pale as winter moonlight. White hair swept back from a face that belonged to old paintings and older fears. His eyes were the color of deep water before a shipwreck, dark gray ringed with silver. And right now every ounce of their terrible focus was on the archive door and the human woman standing beside it. Beatrice did not move away from the door. She held his gaze. "Your door opened for me," she said. Her voice did not shake. She had trained it not to. "I did not break anything. I did not touch any seal. My hand had simply touched the surface and everything unlocked." The silence that followed was not the silence of people who were unimpressed. It was the silence of people who were deeply, profoundly disturbed. One of the guards, tall, silver-haired, wearing the obsidian insignia of the court's inner, stepped forward. His name was Vale, and in the 3 weeks Beatrice had lived in this estate, under what Oberon had called provisional sanctuary, she had learned that Vale feared nothing except Oberon's displeasure. Right now, his expression said something had surpassed both categories. "My king," Vale said carefully, "the Forbidden Archive has not opened in 400 years. The blood ward on that door requires a specific lineage to yield. There is no human lineage that—" "I am aware of what the blood ward requires," Oberon said quietly in the way that made the room temperature drop. He stepped forward, past his guards, past Vale's unfinished sentence, until he stood directly before Beatrice. Up close, he was even more overwhelming, the kind of presence that rewrote the physics of whatever space it occupied. She could feel the cold that radiated from him the way you felt the cold from an open window in winter, steady and ancient and entirely natural to him. His gaze dropped briefly to her hand. Her fingers were still faintly glowing, she realized, a residual shimmer, gold against her brown skin, already fading. "Come inside," he said. Not a request, not precisely a command. Something in between, weighted with a gravity she did not have a name for yet. "Whatever this means, I will not have it discussed in a corridor." She followed him through the door. The guards did not follow. The archive was nothing like she had expected. She had imagined dust, cobwebs, the archetypal Gothic library of a centuries-old vampire's private secrets. What she found instead was a room that breathed. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with iron shelving, and every shelf held glass vessels, hundreds of them, thousands, each containing what looked like compressed light suspended in dark liquid. The air smelled of old iron and something sweeter beneath it, something she could not name. The floor was covered in a map she could not fully read. Inlaid in what she strongly suspected was not ordinary silver. At the room's center, on a stone pedestal, sat a single open book. Its pages were not paper. They were membrane, thin and faintly luminescent, and the text on the visible page was moving, rearranging itself slowly, as though it was still being written. Beatrice stood very still and absorbed all of this with the focused, methodical attention that had kept her alive for 23 years in a world that had been trying to consume her since birth. "What is this place?" she asked. Oberon stood at the threshold for a moment, just a moment, and she saw something cross his face that she had never seen there before. Something raw and carefully contained, like a fault line in marble. "It is the place where I put the things I cannot afford for anyone to know," he said. He came to stand beside her, not quite touching, and looked at the moving book on the pedestal. For a long time, neither of them spoke. "When I was brought before the court of elders," he said at last, his voice carefully measured, "I was presented as something clean and inevitable, born of the ancient line, rightful king by blood and succession. The histories were written that way because the histories serve the court, and the court serves the myth of what I am supposed to be." He paused. None of it was true. Beatrice turned to look at him fully. "Tell me." He looked down at her, and the raw thing in his expression was more visible now, closer to the surface. "Why would I tell you, Beatrice Sable? You have been in this estate for 3 weeks. You are a human runaway, whose own mother betrayed her to the Crimson Court. You have no standing in my world, no lineage, no political utility. You are, by every measure my court uses, irrelevant. And yet your door opened for me," she said without flinching. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something more like recognition. "And yet," he agreed, "she had come here 3 weeks ago with nothing but nerve and necessity. She had spent 8 months running from the Crimson Court, the second great vampire court of Europe, rivals to Oberon's own House of Corvinus, and the organization that had purchased her location from her mother, with the specific intention of using Beatrice as a tool against the king. She had not known precisely what tool. She had not known why her blood was apparently interesting to vampires at all. She had only known that she needed to get inside the one fortress where the Crimson Court could not follow, and that meant walking up to Oberon Corvinus and gambling everything on the possibility that a king with a reputation for iron justice might also have a streak of honor. He had not turned her away. He had given her a room, 3 meals a day, delivered by a human staff member named Priya, who had looked at her with tired sympathy and the clear understanding that her presence here was temporary and entirely at his discretion. In 3 weeks, he had spoken to her directly exactly 4 times. Once when she arrived, once when she had discovered his library and been caught reading his annotated copy of Livy's histories, once when she had broken up a confrontation between 2 of his lower courtiers by saying something so precisely and devastatingly accurate about the political mechanics of their dispute that the entire room had gone quiet, and he had looked at her from across it with an expression she had not been able to read. And now, before conversations. And somehow, standing in this forbidden room with the breathing walls and the living book, and the weight of his 400 years pressing against the air, she felt more clearly seen than she had in her entire life. "The archive opened for you," he said, turning back to the book, "because the Blood Ward was not set to respond to vampire lineage. It was set to respond to mine, to the specific sequence of what I am, which is not," he paused, and she heard the weight of an ancient private pain in that pause, "purely vampire." The air in the room seemed to shift. 437 years ago, he said, a woman named Mira was brought to the court of the vampire lords as a diplomatic hostage. She was human. She was brilliant. She was the daughter of a scholar who had spent 30 years documenting vampire blood lore and the deeper mechanics of what blood can carry between species. His voice was entirely controlled now, the kind of control that came from having told yourself a story so many times it had worn smooth. She was not a hostage in the traditional sense. She was brought there because one of the lords had discovered something in her father's work, a theory. That human blood, in rare cases, carried a dormant resonance with the older magic, the kind that existed before vampires, before blood law, before the courts were built. That in the right bloodline, that resonance could be activated by contact with the oldest of vampire powers, and the offspring of such a union would carry something entirely new, something neither fully human nor fully vampire. Beatrice's throat was very dry. "You were that offspring. My mother was that woman," he said. "She did not survive my birth. The court that had arranged everything disposed of her, presented to the vampire lord who had fathered me as a pure-blood heir and buried her existence in this archive under every lock and seal they possessed, because a vampire king born half of human blood would destabilize every power structure they had spent centuries constructing." He looked at her directly. "I discovered the truth when I was 200 years old. I sealed it again, added my own bloodwords on top of theirs, and told myself it did not change what I was or what I ruled. The silence between them was enormous." "Why did the door open for me?" she asked quietly. "Because your blood carries the same resonance," he said, "the dormant resonance my mother's blood carried. It is extraordinarily rare. Your father's line, I would estimate, though he is almost certainly long dead, it is a genetic thread that passes through families once or twice in a generation, sometimes going dormant for 200 years between manifestations. The Crimson Court found you because one of their scholars recognized the markers in a blood test you gave voluntarily at a hospital 3 years ago. They were not interested in using you as leverage against me because of any political reason. They wanted your blood because they believed that if they could replicate what was done to my mother, they could create another one of you," Beatrice finished. Her voice was very steady. Her heart was not. "Or something worse," he said, "something shaped for their purposes, rather than left to become whatever I became on my own." She looked at the moving book on the pedestal. She looked at the glass vessels full of compressed light. She looked at the map inlaid in the floor, and with the knowledge she had just been given, she began to understand what she was looking at. "This archive," she said slowly, "it is not just records. It is documentation of what you are, all of it, the full mechanics. In the event that I was ever destroyed," he said, "I wanted the knowledge to survive. For what reason, I was never entirely certain. Perhaps because my mother deserved to be remembered somewhere. Perhaps because the thing I am deserved to be understood rather than erased. A pause, perhaps because I was lonely." The word landed in the room with unexpected weight. Beatrice looked up at him and found him looking back, and for a moment the 437 years, and the white hair, and the cold, and the terrifying authority all fell away, and what remained was something she recognized with an almost painful clarity, a person who had been carrying a secret for 2 centuries, a person who had sealed themselves away from the truth of their own origin because the truth was dangerous, and they had been alone with it for so long that sealing it had started to feel like the same thing as surviving it. She understood that from the inside, she had been running for so long that running had started to feel like identity rather than circumstance. "You need to know something," she said. "The Crimson Court. I overheard 2 of their operatives outside the hotel in Lisbon before I ran the last time. They are not just trying to recreate what you are. They have been studying you specifically. They have someone inside your estate." The shift in him was instantaneous and total. The vulnerability closed over like a wound sealing, and what replaced it was the full terrible weight of the vampire king of the House of Corvinus. His eyes went very still and very cold and very focused. "Who told you this?" he said. "No one told me. I speak Portuguese. They did not know that. They did not know I was listening." She met his gaze without flinching. "I did not tell you when I arrived because I did not know enough about your court to know who I could trust, and telling a lie or a partial truth to someone like you seemed significantly more dangerous than telling nothing at all while I gathered information." Another long silence. She watched him process it. "You have been gathering information," he said. "I have been in your library for 3 weeks," she said. "Your political histories, your court records, your annotated maps of Crimson Court territories. I have been building a picture of your court's weaknesses and your rivals' methodologies, because knowledge is the only real currency I have, and I intend to earn my place here with it." Something shifted in his expression. The coldness did not leave, but something else came to sit alongside it, something very close to respect. "Who do you suspect?" he asked. "Vale," she said. The silence that followed was a different quality entirely. "That is a very serious accusation," he said. "I know. That is why I did not make it casually. In the past 3 weeks, I have watched every member of your inner court. Vale receives communication by courier times weekly, which is standard. Except the courier he receives on Thursdays does not come from the Northern Alliance correspondence network. The seal on that courier's bag is subtly wrong. The Corvinus seal pressed in the correct pattern, but with the wrong pressure distribution, which means it was made from a counterfeit stamp rather than your original. And every time I have been brought before you for any reason, Vielle has found a reason to be present and within earshot." She paused. "I could be wrong, but I do not think I am." Oberon stood very still for a long moment, the kind of stillness that was not absence of movement but absolute mastery of it. 3 weeks, he said quietly, as though reminding himself of something. "I had a lot of time in the library," she said. He turned away from her and moved toward the entrance of the archive, and for a moment she thought he was simply going to leave. Then he stopped in the doorway, his back to her, and said, without turning, "You will stay in this archive tonight. The door will lock behind me, but it will open for you when you choose to leave. Do not tell anyone what I told you about my origin. Do not tell anyone what you told me about Vale until I have confirmed it. And if the informant acts before you confirm it," she asked, "then stay close to me," he said. "Nothing will touch you while you are within my sight." He left. The door sealed behind him with a sound like a held breath being released, and Beatrice Sable stood alone in the forbidden archive of the Vampire King and understood, with the precise and terrifying clarity that had always been her greatest asset and her loneliest burden, that she had just changed every single thing she spent the night reading. The living book on the pedestal responded to her touch with the same yielding grace the door had, its pages turning when she placed her hand flat against them, its moving text slowing and steadying as though it recognized her and chose to be still for her benefit. She read about Mira. Her real name was Mirella, she discovered, Mirella Sable of the Dalmatian coast, a scholar's daughter with dark eyes and stubborn intelligence, and a laughing kindness that had apparently unsettled every vampire lord she had ever met, because they had not known what to do with someone who was neither afraid of them nor impressed by them. Beatrice's blood ran cold and hot at the same time. Sable. Her name was Sable. She sat with that for a long time in the breathing dark of the archive, the glass vessels casting their soft, compressed light around her, and understood something she had not known how to articulate before. She was not a random human with a rare blood resonance. She was something much more specific. She was downstream of a lineage that had been touched 437 years ago by the same event that had created Oberon Corvinus. She was not his family. There was no blood relation between them. The resonance in her blood was the echo of what Mirella had passed to her descendants before Mirella died, entirely separate from whatever Oberon carried. But they were connected, had been connected for 4 centuries without either of them knowing it. She thought about her mother selling her location for gold and tried to decide if the betrayal was worse now that she understood what she had been sold as. She decided it was not. Betrayal was betrayal. The dimensions of the currency did not change the nature of the act by the time the archive's subtle light shifted from night blue to the softer grey of early morning. She had read enough to understand 3 things clearly. Oberon's secret, if revealed, would destabilize the entire vampire political order, which was exactly why the Crimson Court wanted it. The Crimson Court did not just want to replicate his origin. They wanted to expose it first, destroy his credibility as a pure-blood king, and then use the resulting chaos to seize territories that House Corvinus had held for centuries. And the informant, whoever it was not collecting intelligence to sell. They were building toward a specific moment, a reveal, a trap that used Beatrice as both the key and the bait, because her presence in the estate and the archive's response to her would be the final proof the Crimson Court needed. She walked out of the archive in the grey morning light, with her spine straight and her face composed, and went to find Oberon Corvinus. She found him in his private study, which she had never been permitted to enter before. The door was open. He was standing at the tall window, looking out over the estate's grounds. Grey stone and black iron and winter-bare trees stretching to the high surrounding wall, with a glass of something dark in his hand that she chose not to examine too closely. He did not look as though he had slept, which she supposed was somewhat irrelevant, given that he did not need sleep the way she did, but there was something in his posture that suggested a long night of its own variety of wakefulness. "It is not just veil," she said from the doorway. He turned, looked at her, read something in her expression. "Sit down," he said, and it was the first time he had said those words to her with anything other than the cool formality of a lord managing an inconvenient house guest. She sat. He sat across from her, set down the glass, and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees in a posture so unexpectedly human that for a moment she could see the person behind the king with painful clarity. Tell me, he said. She told him everything, every observation, every deduction, every connection she had traced through the archive's records over the course of the night. She told him about the Crimson Court's plan as she now understood it, not just exposure, but a staged revelation designed to come at a moment of maximum political vulnerability. Likely during the convocation of the Allied courts that she had read, was scheduled for 6 weeks from now, when every major vampire power would be in attendance, and a destabilizing truth about the Vampire King's origin could be deployed like a weapon in front of witnesses who could not be controlled or silenced after the fact. She told him that Beatrice Sable was her ancestor. She said it plainly, without drama, the way she said everything she needed him to understand clearly. The expression that crossed his face then was the most complex thing she had ever seen on a human or vampire countenance. Grief and recognition, and something she could not name yet, but which settled into the air between them and changed its quality entirely. I knew your blood was connected to hers, he said quietly. I felt it the night you arrived. I could not explain it within any framework I trusted. So I chose to give you sanctuary rather than examine it, because examining it meant examining things I had spent 200 years not examining. I understand that impulse, she said. I have been not examining things for most of my life. What things? He asked, and the question was quiet and entirely genuine, with none of the imperious assessment of their earlier conversations. She thought about it. She thought about a childhood spent being the strange, over-intelligent, over-observant child that no community had quite known what to do with. She thought about discovering at 19 what her blood apparently was. She thought about choosing to run rather than be found, and then running so long and so well that it had hollowed out everything else, left her with sharpness and competence and nothing soft. I have been not examining the fact that I have been surviving instead of living, she said, for years, and it took standing in a room full of someone else's hidden truth to understand that the two things are not the same. The silence that followed was warm rather than weighted. She noticed the difference. We need to deal with Vale, she said, because warmth was something she could examine later, and the threat was immediate. He nodded slowly. I confirmed it last night. After I left you, I had 2 members of my personal guard, people whose loyalty I can stake my existence on, watch the Thursday Courier. They intercepted the communication at the wall. The message was in Crimson Court cipher, but one of my people is familiar enough with their older codes to break it. His jaw tightened. Vale has been feeding them information for 11 months. 11 months, she said, since before I arrived. Since just before I began making diplomatic inquiries about the scheduled convocation. Someone told the Crimson Court that I was considering using the convocation as a venue to formally restructure certain blood law alliances in ways that would reduce their political influence significantly. They have been positioning ever since. He looked at her steadily. Your arrival was genuinely unexpected. But once you were here, and once their scholar confirmed your blood resonance from a secondary source, someone who had seen you in this estate, they adapted their plan to incorporate you. Who confirmed my blood resonance to them? Not Vale. He could not know that without access to things Vale should not have access to. The human staff physician, he said, and the quietness of his voice was the quiet of someone containing very old anger. She took a routine health assessment sample from you in your 2nd week. She has been in Crimson Court employ for 2 years. Beatrice absorbed this. The physician had seemed kind, tired kind like Priya, like all the human staff here, who move through vampire spaces with the careful practiced normalcy of people who had negotiated a complicated peace with their circumstances. She had misjudged that one. "All right," she said. "We have 2 active Crimson Court assets in this estate, and 6 weeks before they intend to detonate everything. What do we do?" The way his mouth moved, that not quite smile again, but warmer than before, suggested the word we had not gone unnoticed. "We do several things," he said. "First, we remove both assets, without alerting the Crimson Court that we have identified them. Because if the Crimson Court knows they have been burned, they will accelerate the timeline. Second, we prepare a counter for the convocation, a way to present the truth of my origin before they can weaponize it. And third," he paused, and something in his gaze was more careful now, more deliberate, "I need to understand the full scope of what your blood resonance means in terms of what you are capable of." The archive responded to you. That is not a passive phenomenon. That is an active one. There are things in that archive that only respond to a specific kind of living blood, and if yours qualifies, you may have access to tools that could change the political equation considerably. She looked at him for a moment. "You are asking me to be part of this, not just a useful piece of information." "Actively part of it, I am asking you if you choose to be," he said, and the distinction was deliberate and clear. "You came here for sanctuary, I gave you that. I am not attempting to convert your sanctuary into obligation." She thought about it for exactly the time it deserved, which was about 4 seconds. "Yes," she said, "I choose to be part of it." The next 2 weeks were the most intensely alive she had felt since childhood, when living and surviving had still been the same thing. They worked together in the archive for long hours every evening, with Oberon guiding her through the vessels and the living texts and the map in the floor, which turned out to be not a geographical map but a relational one, documenting the connections between bloodlines, powers, and ancient vows across 5 centuries of vampire history. Her resonance blood responded to things in the archive the way a key responded to a lock, not forcing anything, simply allowing it to yield. She could open sealed vessels that had been inactive for decades. She could read texts that had locked themselves after Oberon sealed the archive, their language unwinding into something intelligible as her fingers moved across the pages. And she was good at it. Methodically, systematically, intelligently good at understanding what she was reading and drawing connections from it. Oberon watched her work with an expression that changed, slowly and visibly, from careful assessment to something much warmer and considerably less managed. She noticed. She was not unaware of it. She simply filed it in the growing category of things she was examining honestly, rather than running from. They talked constantly about the archive's contents, about blood law mechanics and ancient alliances, about the Crimson Court's historical methodology, and then, gradually, about other things, about what it felt like to carry a secret you could not share with anyone for 200 years, about what it felt like to run so long and so far that you had lost track of what you were running toward, about Mirella, who had apparently written in the archive's living book in her own hand, in the months before she died, a record of everything she had observed about the vampire court that had held her, which was brilliant and precise and heartbreaking and funny in the driest possible way, which Beatrice read aloud to Oberon one evening, and watched him listen to with his eyes closed and something very carefully open on his face. "She would have liked you," he said when she finished. "I would have liked her," Beatrice said. On the 14th day of their work in the archive, Vale made his move. He did not act alone. The Crimson Court had apparently tired of waiting for their scheduled convocation play and decided that Beatrice's continuing presence and continued access to the archive was a risk they could not manage from a distance. They sent 3 operatives through the estate's eastern wall at 2 in the morning, timed to a window. Vale had engineered by manipulating the guard rotation schedule. Beatrice was still in the archive when the alarms sounded. The alarms in Oberon's estate were not electronic. They were blood ward alarms, and when they triggered, every surface in the estate vibrated at a frequency that sat just below hearing but entirely within feeling, a deep bone-level resonance that she had been warned about but had never experienced until that moment. She felt it in her teeth. She felt it in Sesam's place in her blood, where the archive's resonance lived. The archive door opened before she touched it. She stepped into the corridor and found one of Oberon's personal guards, a woman named Seraphel, compact and silver-haired, and radiating the controlled lethality of someone who had been doing this for a very long time, already positioned outside the door. "Stay with me," Seraphel said, and her tone left no room for anything else. "Where is Oberon?" Beatrice asked, dealing with the breach. Seraphel's eyes were scanning the corridor in both directions simultaneously. "He will be," the sound of footsteps in the far corridor. 3 sets, moving fast, not bothering with silence anymore. Seraphel moved to put herself between Beatrice and the sound. "The eastern passage," Beatrice said quickly. "If they came through the east wall, they are not heading for the main halls. They know the estate layout. They are heading for the archive," which means Vale gave them a map. She looked at the archive door, then at the corridor's branching junction 20 feet ahead. "If we go left instead of right, we come out in the estate's secondary courtyard, which is walled but open to the sky. The Crimson Court operatives will not want to be in an open space." Seraphel assessed her for exactly half a second. "Left," she said. They moved. Beatrice kept pace with Seraphel's fast, precise stride, and focused on not doing anything that would make herself a liability. She was not a fighter. She had no illusions about that. What she had was spatial awareness and the mental map she had built of this estate over 3 weeks of careful attention, and those were the tools she used. They came through into the secondary courtyard just as the footsteps behind them reached the archive corridor. Seraphel pulled the door shut and held it from the outside with a kind of strength that reminded Beatrice sharply of what she was and was not capable of. The night sky above the courtyard was clear and cold. Beatrice looked up and calculated distances, and then said, "The interior walkway on the upper level runs directly above us. If Oberon is moving operatives through the estate to contain the breach, they will cross that walkway. We need to be visible." She was not prepared for what happened next. The door Seraphel was holding exploded outward, not with force, with cold, a wave of supernatural cold that frosted the stone and cracked the iron hinges and sent Seraphel sliding back 3 feet with a sound she did not make deliberately. One of the Crimson Court operatives stepped through the ruined doorway, and he was not what Beatrice had expected from a covert operative. He was dressed in the black and crimson of an open Crimson Court militant, which meant they had given up subtlety entirely, which meant they had decided this was a direct assault rather than an intelligence operation. He looked at Beatrice with the focused assessment of someone who had been given a very specific job. "The human comes with us," he said to Seraphel. "Step aside and live." Seraphel, who had a broken arm that she was holding at her side with the expression of someone who was furious rather than pained, said nothing. Beatrice said, "No." The operative blinked. She suspected people did not often say no to him in that particular tone. "I am not a commodity," she said, clearly and precisely. "I am not leverage. I am not bait. I am not a blood sample or a diplomatic tool. If the Crimson Court wants to send a message to the King of House Corvinus, send him a letter." The operative's expression went from focus to something colder. "You do not understand what you are," he said. "I understand it considerably better than you do," she said. "I have spent 2 weeks reading the original documentation." He moved towards Ethel, intercepted him despite her broken arm, which was either magnificent or terrifying, or both, and the brief, vicious struggle that followed gave Beatrice enough time to do the only useful thing she could think of, which was to press her back against the courtyard's central fountain and place her hands flat on the stone basin. Resonance in her blood, the same resonance that had opened the archive door, the same living inheritance from Beatrice Sable 4 centuries back, responded to the cold emanating from the Crimson Court operative the way a flame responded to being deliberately fed. It rose in her. She felt it rise, hot and gold and older than anything she had words for, and it came out through her hands into the stone, and the stone lit up. The entire courtyard blazed, not with fire, with light, the same compressed gold light that filled the archive's glass vessels, but alive and moving and shockingly, genuinely warm against the Crimson Court's supernatural cold. The operative fell back. Seraphil, bleeding from a cut above her eye, looked at Beatrice with an expression that she suspected was as close to astonishment as that particular vampire ever got. Oberon came over the upper walkway railing. He did not use the stairs. He dropped from the 2nd level to the courtyard floor in a single motion that should have been impossible physics, and clearly was not, landing in a low crouch between Beatrice and the operative, with the white of his hair catching the gold light from the stone and his eyes carrying the full cold depth of the deep water grey, and the authority he radiated in that moment was so absolute and so complete that the operative actually stopped moving. 2 more of Oberon's personal guard followed over the railing behind him, landing flanking positions without a word exchanged, coordinated with the seamless precision of people who had operated together for a very long time. "The breach has been contained," Oberon said to the operative, in the calm, terrible quiet that was his most dangerous register. "Your colleagues are in custody. Vale is in custody. You are the last, which means you have a choice." He paused. "You can tell me who gave the authorization for a direct assault on this estate tonight, ahead of the scheduled convocation, or you can spend a very long time regretting that you did not." The operative was quiet for a moment. Then he looked past Oberon at Beatrice, and the look on his face was not what she expected. It was not hatred or calculation. It was something closer to awe, mixed with fear. "She used the resonance," he said. "Yes," Oberon said. "They told us she could not have activated it yet. They said the archive had been sealed, for they were wrong," Oberon said. "About several things. Are you going to answer my question?" The operative answered. The authorization had come from the Crimson Court's reigning lord, a vampire named Radomir Vell, 400 years old, and apparently possessed of the kind of strategic arrogance that came from never having encountered a plan that failed. He had accelerated the timelines, specifically because the archive opening for Beatrice had been reported to him by the physician before she was removed from the estate, and he had understood what it meant. He had wanted to get Beatrice out before Oberon understood what she was capable of, and he had wanted to do it visibly enough to send a message to every court watching the political situation, that the king of House Corvinus was housing something dangerous, something destabilizing, something that suggested his bloodline and his standing were not what they had always been presented as. It was a move designed to force Oberon into a position where the secret came out on Radomir Vel's terms rather than his own. Oberon listened to all of this with the still, focused attention of a person who was already 3 moves ahead. Then he looked at Beatrice over his shoulder, and the look was brief but entire. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. "Seraphel?" Seraphel said shortly. "It will set. Go. You are going to tell me everything," Oberon said to the operative. "And then I am going to send a very specific message to Radomir Vel." He did not sleep that night, neither did she. They spent the remaining dark hours in the archive together, Oberon across the pedestal table from her, dictating and thinking out loud while she read and cross-referenced, and argued with his strategy when his strategy had gaps, which it did, because he was 400 years old, and occasionally thought in the patterns of 400 years ago without realizing it, and she was 23, and thought in patterns that cut across those blind spots like a blade through old silk. He noticed when she caught him in those patterns. He stopped arguing after the 3rd time she was right about one, and said, with something that sounded very much like admiration despite clearly not being accustomed to that particular feeling, "You are infuriating, you are welcome," she said. "That was not a compliment." "I know," she said. "Accept it anyway." The silence that followed had a texture she had not encountered before, warm and specific and entirely mutual. 3 days later, Oberon sent his message to Radomir Vel. It was not a threat. Threats were what you sent when you needed the other party to believe something you could not prove. Oberon sent evidence. He sent the full recovered testimony of the archive, Mirella's own documentation, authenticated by the living book, translated and annotated, and presented in the priest's language of vampire blood law protocol, together with a formal declaration of origin that he had written himself and sealed with every blood ward authentication available to a king of his standing. He sent it not to Radomir Vel alone, but to every major court on the continent simultaneously, through the formal diplomatic courier network. 3 weeks before the convocation, he told the truth, in other words, on his own terms, in his own words, before anyone else could tell it differently. The political fallout was immediate and enormous. Beatrice watched it unfold from the estate's communications room, reading the return messages and dispatches as they arrived, cataloguing responses as Lansons with the focused precision that had become in the past weeks genuinely collaborative rather than solitary. 3 courts withdrew from their conditional alignments with the Crimson Court immediately upon reading the declaration. 2 sent messages of cautious support. 1 sent a message that was purely curious, which Beatrice flagged as the most interesting response in the stack. Oberon came to stand behind her as she sorted through the dispatches and looked over her shoulder at the flag she had placed. "The Court of the Eastern Compact," he said. "Lord Vasiliev Drac. He has been neutral for 60 years. His neutrality just became more expensive," she said. "His message is not cautious or political. It is genuinely curious about the blood resonance mechanics. He is a scholar. He wants to understand what this means for the historical documentation of the early courts." She paused. "He might be an ally, a real one, not a political calculation." You think I should respond personally? I think you should respond honestly, she said. The way you responded to the continent, that is what changed the equation tonight. Not strategy, truth. He was quiet behind her for a moment. She could feel the presence of him, the cold and the warmth that coexisted in him in that specific way she had grown entirely accustomed to. And then his hand came to rest on her shoulder. Briefly, deliberately. I have not told the truth about what I am to anyone, he said, in 400 years. She turned to face him. He was close, standing just at the border of what she might have called comfortable distance 3 weeks ago, and considerably less than that now. How does it feel? She asked. He thought about it. She watched him think about it, watched the careful, honest consideration move across his face. Like something I put down that I did not know I was carrying, he said. She understood that from the inside too. The things you put down when you finally stopped running. Oberon, she said, and using his name, just his name, without the distance of formality, felt like the most deliberate thing she had done since walking through his gates. Beatrice, he said, and the way he said, it was the opposite of formality. It was precise and careful, and entirely warm, the way he said everything that mattered to him. We should discuss what happens after the convocation, she said. My sanctuary here was provisional. That was the arrangement. That was the arrangement, he agreed. Is it still the arrangement? He reached out and brushed a strand of hair back from her face, and the gesture was so unhurried and so deliberate and so entirely unlike the dangerous, controlled, distant figure she had first met in this archive that she felt the full weight of how much had changed in these weeks, not eroded, transformed. He had not become less formidable. He had become someone she knew, and knowing made the formidability into something different, something that she trusted rather than simply respected from a careful distance. I would like to renegotiate the arrangement, he said quietly. What terms would you propose? She asked. Stay, he said, not as a political asset, not as a blood resonance phenomenon, not as an intelligence resource, though you are formidable in all 3 capacities. Stay, because this estate has been a sealed archive for 400 years, and so have I, and both doors opened for you, and neither of them wants to close again. She held his gaze for a moment that felt the size of all those centuries. Yes, she said. He kissed her then, in the communications room with the political dispatches spread across the table, and the blood ward alarms freshly reset, and the estate settling back into its enormous, complicated, breathing quiet. And it was not a tentative kiss or a careful one. It was the kiss of someone who had been carrying a truth for 200 years and had finally set it down and understood that setting it down did not diminish it but made it real in a way that was entirely new. It was thorough and warm, and it lasted long enough that the stack of dispatches became considerably less interesting to both of them. When they separated, she looked up at him with the calm, clear, fully present expression that was entirely hers and said, You realize we still have the convocation in 3 weeks and an entire Crimson Court political offensive captor. I am aware, he said, and Radomir Vel is not going to simply accept the preemptive declaration. He will have a response strategy. He will, Oberon agreed. And we need to bring Lord Vasiliev Drac into the conversation properly before the convocation, because his scholarly interest in the blood resonance mechanics could be either a genuine alliance or a sophisticated intelligence play, and we need to know which. We do, he said. She looked at him. You are very calm about all of this. I am calm about all of this, he said. Because you are standing in my estate with no apparent intention of leaving, and I have 400 years of practice managing complicated political situations, and this is the first time in any of them that I have not been managing them alone. That landed in her chest in the specific way that things landed when they were entirely true, entirely new. "Come on," she said, and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, cold and deliberate and careful. "Show me where the Crimson Court's political correspondence is archived. I want to map Radomir Vel's decision tree before morning." The 3 weeks between that night and the convocation were extraordinary. They worked together with the kind of fluency that usually took years to build, each finding the other's gaps and filling them without friction or competition, her speed and pattern recognition, complementing his depth and historical knowledge, his 4 centuries of reading vampire political behavior, complementing her ability to see the present moment without the distortions of long memory. They built a full strategic picture of the convocation's likely dynamics, identified every party whose alignment was uncertain, and prepared a presentation of the blood resonance documentation that was not a defense but a history, thorough, honest, and presented with the specific confidence of people who no longer had anything to hide. Beatrice also spent time with the archive, not strategically, personally. She read Mirella's sections of the living book with the reverence they deserved, and added her own entries as the book seemed to want her to, its pages offering themselves to her pen with the same yielding grace they had offered everything else. She wrote about running, she wrote about the strange, lit quality of arriving somewhere and choosing to stay. She wrote about the experience of having your blood administer something your mind had never been told. Oberon read what she wrote. He did not comment on it immediately. Late one evening, sitting across from her at the pedestal table with the gold light of the archive vessels around them, he simply reached across and covered her hand with his and said, "She would be glad you found this place. She would be glad you stopped hiding it," Beatrice said. The convocation was held in the Grand Assembly Hall of the Neutral City, a vast, ancient stone complex beneath Vienna that had been used by vampire courts for political gatherings since the 14th century. Beatrice walked in on Oberon's right side, which was the position of acknowledged close counsel, and the number of eyes that tracked her entry with complicated expressions was a useful measure of how thoroughly the advanced documentation had circulated. Radomir Vel was not what she had expected. He was older looking than most vampires she had encountered, not genuinely old in physical appearance, but carrying it deliberately, the way certain kinds of power wore antiquity as an aesthetic. He had the dark coloring of the old Slavic vampire lineages, dark-haired and pale-eyed, and very still in the way that very dangerous things were still. He looked at Beatrice the way one looks at something that has complicated their plans considerably. She met his gaze without expression. The session opened with the formal reading of declarations, which, in the vampire court tradition, meant several hours of protocol that she had prepared for and navigated with the careful, annotated to convocation procedure she had assembled from the archive's political records. Oberon presented his declaration of origin personally, standing before the full assembly, voice carrying the absolute authority of a king on his own ground, saying the words that 4 centuries of sealed archives had kept silent. The room was extraordinary. She watched it, watched the ripple of political calculation moving through every face in the assembly, watched the careful repositioning of postures and expressions as courts assessed what this meant for their alliances and interests. Watched Lord Vasiliev Drac lean forward with the focused attention of a scholar finally receiving a primary source, and she watched Radomir Vel. He did not look surprised. He looked like a person whose plan had been anticipated and was recalculating. But the recalculation was constrained. She had understood this before the convocation, and she had built the counter for it. The Crimson Court's strategy had depended entirely on the revelation being theirs to deliver. Robbed of that, robbed of the destabilizing shock, they were left with an opposition to a voluntary declaration which, in blood law terms, required a challenge backed by genealogical evidence that Radomir Vel did not have, because the original documentation was sealed in the Forbidden Archive, and the Forbidden Archive had opened for Beatrice Sable, and Beatrice Sable had spent 3 weeks reading everything in it, and was standing 3 feet from the vampire king of House Corvinus with every fact she needed to counter every move the Crimson Court could make. Radomir Vel made his challenge anyway. It was technically permissible and politically necessary for him to do it. Backing down without challenging would signal weakness to every court in the room. Beatrice requested the floor. There was a silence. Humans did not traditionally request the floor at vampire convocations. The assembly chair, a very old vampire named Dracolesti, who ran the proceedings with the dry, weary precision of someone who had presided over 4 centuries of vampire politics, looked at Oberon. Oberon said, "She speaks as my acknowledged counsel. The floor is hers." The objections were immediate and multiple, and she let them settle before she began. And then she spoke for 45 minutes. She spoke in the precise, technical language of blood law that she had absorbed from the archive. She presented the documented genealogical record of Mirella Sable. She presented the evidence trail for the original court's deliberate falsification of Oberon's presented lineage. She presented the mechanics of the blood resonance in terms accessible to a mixed audience of scholars and political operators. And she presented the central point that she had understood from the first night in the archive, that the original falsification had not been Oberon's act, but an act done to him, before his consciousness, by a court that had committed multiple violations of blood law in arranging his conception and in concealing its nature. Oberon's origin was not a disqualification from kingship under the actual blood law properly read. It was the opposite. A king who had been misrepresented by the very court he had later reformed was a king with a stronger moral claim, not a weaker one. When she finished, Lord Vasiliev Drac was the first to speak in support. The challenge failed. Not narrowly, comprehensively. Every undecided court in the room came down on the side of Corvinus within 4 hours of the session's conclusion, partly because the case was solid, and partly because there is something specific about watching a human woman and dismantle the political strategy of an ancient vampire court with 45 minutes of rigorously documented argument that makes an impression even on people not naturally inclined toward humans. Radomir Vel left the convocation early. His face, as he left, held the particular expression of a man who had miscalculated the intelligence of a person he had never bothered to assess. Lord Vasiliev Drac requested a private meeting with both of them the following morning, which turned out to be exactly what Beatrice had assessed: genuine scholarly interest, combined with genuine political goodwill, and the beginning of an alliance that would prove, over the coming years, to be one of the most valuable in House Corvinus's history. The return to the estate was quiet and cold and deeply, profoundly peaceful. Oberon was quiet for most of the journey, not the sealed, managed quiet of their early acquaintance, but the quiet of someone who had put down a very heavy thing and was still feeling the novelty of not carrying it. She sat beside him in the car and did not push for conversation, which she knew was not what he needed. And after a while he said, "You destroyed him." "I presented facts," she said. "You destroyed him," he said again, and the edge in his voice was warm. 45 minutes, every foundation he had built the strategy on. "You had already started the demolition," she said. "I just accelerated the timeline." He took her hand in the dark of the car and held it. His thumb moved across her knuckles in a small, deliberate gesture that said more than most speeches she had heard. "What do you want?" he asked. "Not what is politically useful or strategically logical. What do you want, Beatrice?" She thought about it honestly. She thought about the archive and the living book, and Mirella's words, and the way the resonance in her blood had risen to meet the cold in that courtyard, and burned gold in the dark. She thought about 45 minutes of not running from anything. She thought about what it felt like to walk into a room beside someone rather than alone in it. "I want the things I have been running away from," she said. "A place that is mine, work that is real, someone I trust." She looked at him. "I want the archive. I want to finish documenting what is in it, properly, with academic rigor, as a historical record that cannot be sealed away again. I want to understand everything Mirella understood and more." She paused. "And I want the other thing too." "The other thing," he said. "You know what the other thing is," she said. The quiet smile that moved across his face was different from any expression she had catalogued on him before. It was simple and unguarded and entirely human in the most essential sense, the sense that had nothing to do with species and everything to do with the specific vulnerability of wanting something and allowing yourself to say so. "I know what the other thing is," he agreed. The estate in winter had a particular quality that she had come to love, the way the cold pressed against the windows and made the interior warmth feel deliberate and earned. She spent the evening in the archive, updating the living book, adding the account of the convocation in the precise and unadorned prose that Mirella would apparently have appreciated. According to the style notes Mirella herself had left in the book's earlier pages. The vessels on the shelves glowed warmly. The map in the floor reflected the gold light. The air smelled of old iron and something sweet that she had finally identified, after weeks, as the scent of very old blood kept carefully, the distilled residue of everything that had been preserved here. Oberon came to find her an hour later, as he had come to find her every evening since the night the door first opened. He sat across from her and watched her write for a while, and she let him watch because she was not running from being seen anymore. "There is a legal mechanism in blood law," he said eventually, "for the formal recognition of a human counsel within a vampire court household. Not a servant relationship, not a diplomatic appointment. A formal partnership recognition with full standing under blood law and under the house's own codes." He paused. "It is not commonly invoked. Historically, it has only been used when the relationship in question is specific." She looked up from the book. "Is that a question?" she asked. "It is," he said. She looked at him across the pedestal table in the breathing archive, with the gold light and the moving texts, and the 4 centuries of carefully preserved truth between them, and felt the full, specific weight of choosing something rather than running from it. "Yes," she said. The formal partnership ceremony was held in the archive itself. 3 weeks later, witnessed by Seraphil and Lord Vasiliev Drac and Priya from the human staff, who cried in the thoroughly unashamed way of someone who had watched this develop from a safe distance, with a great deal of invested emotional interest. The ceremony was simple and ancient, and involved the exchange of a specific blood law vow that was, in its original Old World language, one of the most beautiful things Beatrice had ever heard, which she had translated herself from the archive's records, and could confirm was genuinely lovely in both the original and the modern rendering. Oberon spoke the vow in the original language, in the low, deliberate voice that carried everything he kept most carefully, and she spoke her response in the same language, because she had spent 3 weeks learning it from the archive's language documents with the same focused ferocity she applied to everything she cared about, and the expression on his face when she spoke, the old words in the correct dialect, was the most entirely open thing she had ever seen on him. Then he kissed her in the way that had nothing to do with politics or strategy or ancient vows, and everything to do with the specific simple fact of 2 people who had been sealed away from their own truths, finding, in each other, the one presence in the world that made truth feel like something you could carry rather than something that would crush you. Outside the archive, the estate was quiet and alive. The guards on the walls were alert and loyal. The roster had been rebuilt carefully in the months following the convocation, with Oberon's characteristic thorough precision and Beatrice's characteristic ability to read people's real motivations within approximately 45 minutes of conversation. The Crimson Court had retreated to lick its political wounds and recalculate, which it would continue to do, because power structures did not simply dissolve, and Radomir Vel was not finished. But he was significantly less dangerous than he had been, and the alliance with Lord Vasiliev Drax's Eastern Compact had changed the continental political balance in ways that would take the Crimson Court years to adjust to. The living book was filling up. Beatrice wrote in it every evening, history, analysis, personal record, the kind of careful and honest documentation that Mirella had begun 4 centuries ago in a court that had tried to erase her. The resonance in Beatrice's blood grew neither stronger nor weaker with the months. It simply became more familiar, more integrated, the way any deep part of yourself became when you stopped treating it as a problem to be managed and started treating it as simply what you were. In the spring, when the estate's grounds came back to life with the particular abruptness of northern springs, Oberon took her to the library. The main library, not the archive. The vast multi-level room where she had first been caught reading his Livy, and showed her the section he had cleared and refurnished, which was now entirely hers. A desk the right height for her particular working style, shelving organized according to the system she had developed over months. A window that looked out over the courtyard with the fountain that had blazed gold on the night the Crimson Court had tried to take her. She stood in the middle of it and looked at him. "You measured the desk height," she said. "I observed the desk height for several months, and then measured it," he said. She laughed. It was a specific kind of laugh, the kind that was entirely surprised and entirely genuine and carried nothing guarded in it. And he looked at her, making it with the expression that she had come to know as the one he wore when he was allowing himself to be entirely present in a moment, rather than managing it from a slight, careful distance. "You are extraordinarily good at that," he said. "At laughing," she said. "At being here," he said. "Fully without armor." She looked at him steadily. "I learned it recently," she said, "from someone who had been carrying armor for about 200 years. Only 200, the first 200 you had the excuse of the sealed archive, she said. The second 200 was stubbornness. Almost certainly, he agreed. She crossed the room and kissed him, brief and warm and entirely without ceremony, in the way of people who had stopped needing ceremony for the things that were simply true. Outside, the estate breathed and settled in the spring afternoon, the blood words humming their quiet, constant frequency along the walls, the archive below glowing with its steady gold, the living book open to today's page, waiting. The city beyond the estate's high walls moved in the specific, complicated rhythm of a modern world that had no idea what lay beneath it, what courts operated in its older underbelly, what ancient vows were spoken in its basement archives, and what new ones had been added to the record by people who had found each other across the enormous distance of 4 centuries of sealed truth. Beatrice Sable, counsel and partner to the king of House Corvinus, blood-resonant descendant of Mirella Sable, formerly the most determined runaway in 4 countries, sat down at her properly measured desk and opened her current working document, which was a comprehensive academic analysis of blood law's historical treatment of human vampire lineage intersections that she intended to present at the next convocation as a formal proposal for legal reform. Oberon sat in the chair across from her, reading correspondence and occasionally making observations that she argued with and occasionally agreed with in the easy collaborative rhythm that had become the texture of their days. The archive waited below, patient and luminous, full of truth that no longer needed to be sealed. The door, as always, would open when she touched it. And outside the window, the courtyard fountain stood in the spring light, its stones still faintly warm with the memory of gold. On the night a door chose to open and 2 sealed things found their ways back to themselves through each other's, it was by every measure that mattered a beginning.